Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Collective Impact Forum's May virtual coffee. I am Jennifer Juster, Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. If you're in Pacific time zone like me, I should probably say welcome to a virtual brown bag lunch as well. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we dive into our conversation with our guest, I'm going to spend a few minutes just orienting you to the logistics of the session. Today's conversation will run for 60 minutes. We'll spend roughly the first half of our time together with me chatting with Paul with a few questions that I have, and then we're going to turn to you all for additional questions. And we really want to hear from you, so please keep close to your computer, and there is a chat box on the screen that you will see where you can submit questions. My colleague Robert Albright is joining us as well, and he will be curating those questions and asking them of Paul during the second half of our time together. One more housekeeping note, we will be making a recording of the chat available to everybody afterwards in case you'd like to share it with any colleagues who couldn't join us today. So as a reminder to join the conversation, you can use the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. As always, also feel free to tweet. Hashtags are on the screen. And if you have any questions that are more in technical nature, you can email info@collectiveimpactforum.org, and our colleague Tracy will help you out. So without further ado, I'm actually going to turn it over to Robert to do a little poll so we get a sense of who's on the line with us today.
Great. Thanks, Jen. I'm going to launch the poll. This is the question that we want to hear from you all. What role do you play in your collective impact initiative? It's actually going to be a two-part poll, and I'm going to launch the first part right now. You can select more than one option, so I'm going to pause for a moment while you all select your roles. It could be more than one role that you play. This is, again, the first part of a two-part poll. So I see some responses already coming in. I'll just pause for maybe 10 or 15 seconds and let you all finish this first part of the poll. I see a few more votes coming in. Perfect. So about 63%, 64% of you are backbone team members, 16% funder, 30% part of a partnering organization, 38% steering committee member, and 8% community member. So that was the first poll. I'm actually going to then now launch the second part of that poll. So you'll see another poll that's going to pop up right here. This is the second part of that question. So again, the same question, what role do you play in your collective impact initiative? But we've got some additional roles here, and I'll pause and let you all indicate your roles for this question. Great. A good number of you have already voted. Thanks for doing that. We'll just take another 5 or 10 seconds, and then I'll close out this poll. Interesting. So 48% of you are providing technical assistance or consulting to collective impact initiatives. We've got 9% researchers and academics, 6% policymaker, 4% business leader, and then 34% other. We know there's a lot of other roles we couldn't fit on this poll, but I appreciate you all filling out that poll. With that, I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Thank you, Robert. And now, sorry about skipping slides here. Now it is my pleasure to introduce us to our guest of the day, Paul Schmitz. Paul is the Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum and also leads his own consulting firm, Leading from the Inside Out. Paul formerly spent 21 years as CEO of Public Allies and has been a faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, which he will talk a little bit about today, for over 20 years. Paul writes, speaks, and facilitates trainings often about collective impact with a focus on leadership, culture, community engagement, and racial equity. So with that, Paul, it is great to have you with us. Let's hear you on the line.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm drinking Milwaukee's Collectivo Mexican Kulak tea coffee, so I'm made sure I had my coffee before we started. It's not virtual. Maybe for you it is.
Perfect. Perfect, perfect. So, Paul, I think a great place to start would be to have you tell us a little bit about the background of the Community Engagement Toolkit, which many folks on the line have seen that you recently published.
Great. So, as Jennifer said, I spend most of my time visiting. I've certainly consulted with several collective impact efforts, and I spend a lot of time traveling and visiting them to do training and speaking. And what I noticed was lots of folks were hitting walls around community engagement. In many cases, it was an afterthought, I would say in most, where after people had gotten started and been moving their process, they had at some point realized that they had never really engaged community or engaged it very lightly, and were trying to fix that partway through the process. On the other hand, there were people who did it, but did it kind of ham-handedly. And so what I was trying to do was think about, as I worked with various groups, how do you on the front end really plan rigorously for a robust community engagement effort? And that's what I tried to do is basing this on work I've done through the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, through my time at Public Allies, through some clients I worked with, and there were about, before I released this last month, about 24 groups had used it, and so it definitely went through several iterations as I used it with groups and learned, but try to figure out, what if someone did a comprehensive plan would they put in place to really have a robust community engagement initiative? And that's what this effort is meant to do, and that I hope people will benefit from using.
Thanks, Paul. And just one point of clarification that at least I always find helpful when talking about community engagement is, how are you defining community when we talk about community engagement, at least for this conversation today and for the toolkit?
Yeah. So when I talk about community engagement in this respect, what I mean is those who will, the beneficiaries of the work that we're doing, their families, friends, and neighbors. So it is not meant to be like grassroots professionals. It's not meant to be grass tops leaders or grassroots leaders. It is really about the engagement of the people who are the intended beneficiaries, their families, friends, and neighbors. It's trying to get the people who will live with the results of the work involved in the design and implementation of the work.
Thanks, that's super helpful. And so just at a high level, could you talk a little bit more about the contents of it and who might find the toolkit more useful? And after that, we'll turn to talk a little bit more about community engagement itself.
Yeah, so basically it's meant for any effort that is working on comprehensive community solutions or launches of community programs. It could be used by funders, it could be used by local government, it could be used by nonprofits, it could be used by coalitions. But the point is to really get robust and clear about what you're trying to do. And quickly it begins with being really clear on your purpose. I found the biggest thing I found when I talk to people about community engagement is I ask them, why is community engagement important to your results and the work that you're doing? And often they give me some feels good answer or what, but to me, you've got to be really clear about your purpose and own that purpose if it's going to be meaningful. And to me, the purpose that makes it worth doing is if you're clear that you cannot achieve the intended results in the community without the participation of those who will live with the results and those around them. And if you're clear that you will not have all the information and perspectives and experience you need to make the best decisions without that, then it's worth doing. If you're doing it as something nice to do, it's not worth doing. You have to really believe that it's necessary to your results and that is felt throughout whatever board, committee, or table you're making decisions around is, we need to do this if we're going to be successful. And if you're in a necessary versus nice, you'll come at it very differently. Another tool that early on I think is really important is the community engagement spectrum. A lot of people have seen. It came from the International Association of Public Participation, and many people are familiar. It's inform, consult, involve, collaborate, empower. And what I always say to groups when I train on this is, wherever you are on the spectrum, own it. because the thing that creates the most conflict is when you use language on the right side of the spectrum and deliver engagement on the left side, which I see all the time. We're going to empower community. We have all this engagement. We're going to have a forum, and we're going to tell the community what's going on and ask for their advice after we've made our decisions, right? Like, it's so often I see the language of collaboration, empowerment, involvement, and delivery of something more along inform, consult. And I find if you're in the place of consult and what you want is to get the community's feedback on ideas before you implement something, then own that's where we are in the spectrum and make that promise to community and fulfill that promise. And it's okay. If that's where you are, that's okay. And I do say people should try and push their comfort zone to move further right, but you have to build capacity to do anything on the right well. Groups that get into collaboration empowerment, there's a lot of capacity building and a lot of investment that needs to be made to do that well. And so you've got to be clear, what do you have capacity to do? What is going to help you get to the result you're trying to achieve? And then own where you are, communicate where you are, and fulfill those promises. The other tools run through everything from a primer on asset-based community development and the idea of really putting residents in the center of the work and recognizing that they're producers of results, not just recipients or advisors of results. So often we only think of community residents as people who can come and give us advice, and we don't think of all the way that residents help each other every day and think of all the assets that are inherent in communities, and we only think of programs as answers and not the people who are there. There's a tool around equity at the table, really analyzing your tables. Ask, do we have people who have lived experience at our tables or family members with lived experience? Do we have people who live in the target neighborhoods who have lived in the target neighborhoods? Do we have people who demographically reflect our community or not? And really doing that analysis of our tables as a way to understand what perspectives do we have, and do we have all the perspectives, expertise, and experience we need at our table to make the best decisions about the community, the issue, and the population involved. And to do that, we've got to get real about who's at our table. Once we're clear about who is and who is not at our table, brings to the next tool, which is really looking at the issue of how do we test our assumption and bias? How do we understand what perspectives we might be lacking and how we're making sure that we're testing our perspectives to keep us out of groupthink, and especially privileged groupthink. Then it gets into assessing audiences and understanding for every audience, intended beneficiaries, their families, their neighbors, faith leaders, grass top influencers, volunteers, thinking of all the different populations, what contributions can they make, why will they care about this thing we're working on, and how will they benefit from participating. And then figuring out your priority audiences, and for each audience that you prioritize, that you want to engage, being clear about why they're a priority, what do they care about, why are they interested in these goals, how have you engaged this group to date, how engaged are they, what do you want them to do, what barriers might they face, and what are the best ways to approach them, and really, again, planning out. There's a tool that's, the 8th one is all tips around clarifying and communicating the purpose so people are clear why they're there, meeting people where they are in terms of how you organize the meetings and the work to accommodate people, orienting and preparing community members for success, making sure you're doing all the things necessary that they walk in the room without having their power immediately diminished because they don't know the jargon, they don't know the people, they don't know the dynamics, they don't know the decisions made to date. Acknowledging and mitigating power differentials is important. Facilitating inclusively, making sure that you're making room for those who might be quieter and those who are newer. And allowing for some steam to blow. And this is actually an important tip, because what I found is that people who have not been invited to tables before, the first time they come to tables, they usually don't come happy. And the question is, how do you just acknowledge and allow some steam to blow and recognize that that's part of the trust building, is allowing people to kind of raise concerns and feelings from the past that might need to be voiced to move forward, and not freaking out at that and thinking it's something to repair but something to engage. The 9th tool is about figuring out who are the partners locally that can connect you to people rather than bringing in people from outside. The 10th is about recognizing that this work takes patient urgency and that you probably have to slow some things down and stop some things to do this well. And what are you willing to trade off in order to do engagement well? Because you're going to lose some efficiency. Where are you willing to spend that efficiency on behalf of this work? And it's really important to just be clear and own that. Related to that, you have to look at what capacity do we need to build? What capacity is it going to take to do this well? What staff time, staff skills, culture change, training of our governance body, leadership staff or volunteers? What professional support do we need? What capacity do we need to build in order to carry this out? And finally, it's change management. How do we manage change this process for the people involved? So those are the tools in summary and in brief. But that's basically what I put together. And the goal is by the end of the whole thing, if you've done all of this, you've got a really clear sense of why you're doing it, who you need to engage, how you're going to engage them, what things you want to put in place so that you can make sure they're successful. And it's really, again, just trying to put some rigor behind this to make sure it works well.
That's awesome, Paul. Thank you. And I know a couple of folks are asking in the Q&A box if there are slides or where they could actually get the toolkit. So apologies that we did not have the link up there. We shared the link here in the chat box. It's also a tool that's on the Collective Impact Forum. And from what we can tell so far, Paul, people are finding it very useful. Over 1,000 people have downloaded that tool just since it's been published. And so we welcome everyone's feedback on it for sure. And if you haven't yet downloaded it, please go ahead and do so with the link that Robert put in the, in the chat box here. So with all that context, and you've really whet people's appetite to actually look at the tool itself, I have a couple of questions for you about the actual practice of community engagement, diving into some of the things that you just talked about. So I think a good place to start is asking, how does someone get those first few core community leaders involved so that others in the community could feel more comfortable to come on board if it's not a community or a process where community has historically been really actively engaged?
Well, I think the mistake a lot of folks do is they go to institutional organizational leaders somewhere and assume because someone runs an organization in that community or for that population, they are a trusted leader for that population. And the important thing is to understand and find out from people who are the trusted leaders, who are the people that are trusted, that are looked to as resources, that are seen as real assets, and really to look for those people. And to the best way is to find those gateway leaders who are well trusted, really know the community, and can help you make those connections and find people who are who are great. I saw a process recently where an effort to get community members involved did a very random approach to finding people, and they got random people. And there's nothing wrong with going to community partners, pastors, principals, and others and finding out whatever the issue is, like who are some of the passionate parents or residents or leaders or people in this neighborhood who really care about this issue or are involved with it, and try and utilize partners to help you surface people who aren't just like randomly involved because they're from the community, people who feel some stake in the issue. And again, finding people who are trusted and known will make a big difference.
And so on the other end of the spectrum, so that's really about getting started. Do you have any tips on how to maintain community engagement over a long time, multiple years, for example?
You're always going to have some shift, right? Because people's lives are complex and their time changes and needs change. So that's why you also don't want to do it in a token way, like why you want to have more people involved, so that you have some ability for float within that in terms of people's involvement. I think that the main thing is that they're at the table in ways where they feel that their value is adding value. And I think when people get discouraged is when they either feel like they're not really doing much, like the conversations are very institutional, very above their awareness. It's all inside speak, and it seems like the deals are done outside of the meeting they're at. You know, if it's an inclusive process and people feel engaged, then they're going to participate for a longer period of time. So it's just important to make sure that again, that you're clear about what are the ways they're going to engage, and to make sure that their contributions have meaning that is acknowledged as valuable to the process, and that they feel that what they're doing is valuable to the result they're trying to produce. If people don't feel what they're doing is making a difference or their participation is making a difference, they're not going to stay engaged.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Paul, so I know that this is a tricky question, but I'd love to hear your reflections of how do you create truly community-driven collective impact initiatives in light of existing power structures? This is a question that was submitted by one of the folks on the virtual coffee in advance. I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
Well, I think that, again, you know, if where you are on that spectrum is empower, which means that residents have full decision-making power and organizations support that, you need to build capacity to do that, which means that if you say to a group of residents who don't know what programs are in their neighborhood or how things work or how institutional structures work or funding and all that, and you ask them to make these decisions over resources that they really don't understand or have experience that helps them understand how best to make those decisions, you're kind of doing them a disservice as well as yourself. And so the question is, what do you have to do to build capacity of people to participate fully and feel they have whatever tools they might not bring in from their toolbox that they can apply to the effort. And again, it requires a tremendous amount of trust building. It requires probably some guardrails around it in terms of whatever institutional prerogatives or rules that the funding or the organizations involved have. And then it's a matter of building people's capacity to be able to participate in the way that, again, where their contribution makes the most difference. You know, I worked with a project recently that was on the Collaborate, which is a second to that. Collaborate means there's 50-50 governing power. And again, there you have to build relationships and make sure that there's not kind of a dynamic where the professionals override the residents all the time. Ideally, if we're facilitating well and building relationships well, and the results are clear and we're being data and experience driven and honoring perspective, then that's going to work out. But at times there are real power dynamics in the room, and the only way to mitigate power dynamics is transparency. The more we can bring things to light, name people's interests, recognize those dynamics that are in the room and the realities that may constrain our options or abilities to act, the more we make that transparent, the less the power operates behind the scenes. And if we don't make that stuff transparent and things are happening to me that people don't understand, again, that'll diminish people's involvement.
Yeah. And Paul, could you talk, another question that came in was if you could talk a little bit about really putting equity at the center of collective impact work, and in particularly the community engagement component.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pieces of that, right? And I always think of equity as an upstream and downstream issue. And I feel like we've gotten better at talking about downstream, which is disaggregating data, looking at differential impact, looking at how we might have to use different strategies and tactics with different populations to get to the same result. But I think the upstream is really important too, which again, community engagement helps correct for, which is who's at the table making decisions? How much do we reflect and represent the community, the population, the issue we're working on? Do we have lived experience? Do we represent and reflect? Do any of us live, or have we lived, or do we have family members who live in the areas we're trying to address? How much personal stake do we have in the game? And so I think that focusing there and understanding and committing to correct equities upstream will help us make better decisions when we look at the data downstream and better understand that. And of course, along with that, we have to understand root causes, and we have to look at history and really understand the dynamics that brought us to where we are, and the historical results and trauma and things like that. So we have to educate ourselves about communities. We have to do the work downstream, but again, if we do the work upstream, the rest of it should follow pretty well if we have a good process. But if the upstream is not reflective, not representative, does not have lived experience, has no connection to the neighborhoods we're working in, we're not going to have the best information and the best perspectives and the best experience and expertise to make good decisions on behalf of a community.
And Paul, I've actually heard you sometimes talk about that as we don't only need an equity lens, but we also very much need an equity mirror. So I just will share that because I've heard you use that, and I think that's a really also
a good
analogy.
And I have an article on the Collective Impact Forum website about applying an equity mirror to collective impact that's kind of based on that, which is this notion of how do we stop. Because I went to a lot of conferences where I saw these groups starting to talk about equity, but it's still all white people talking about it. And they were talking about it all in terms of the services, but not in terms of who's making decisions. And that's where we really need to also focus on it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Robert to share some additional questions that have come in through the Q&A, and feel free for those of you on the line to put additional questions in. So over to you, Robert.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks to all of you who already asked some great questions. We'll try and get to as many as possible. So Paul, one question that came through was, could you discuss the relationship between authentic engagement and appropriate sharing of resources? This person said too often, a certain amount of money might get funded for a project to quote unquote engage the community, but the community doesn't actually have access to or control of funds that are spent out by the prime grantee. So any thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think part of the authentic engagement goes back to clarifying the purpose of your engagement. Why are you doing it? Why do you think it's important to your results? And then being clear about where you are on the spectrum with all of your institutional prerogatives, et cetera. And I think that, as I said, authentic engagement might be that we're going to consult with community on this. But it might also be that we're going to collaborate. And so I think you just have to be clear where you are. I think, again, the question is how you build relationships and how you share power and give power. As you move to the right on that spectrum, every step is a release of power from institutions to community. And so, and that's exactly what it is. It's each step is letting go of power. So I think that the appropriate resources and all that, I do think that it's important that where we can, we invite residents to participate in decisions within whatever guidelines we have with the funding that we have available. I was talking to a client today who, in a similar way, had some resources to spend, and we talked about, well, there's people at the table who are interested in it, so we said, well, let's just have them identify how they would use the money in a general way and maintain for the staff the ability to decide which organizations might get it, but to have the groups decide what strategies in the short term would you put those resources to that would accelerate our results. So again, I think that, I don't know if I answered it exactly, but I do think that that where we can, making sure that resource decisions are tied to it, it does create more, when all the resource decisions are made outside the table that's deciding the strategies, that's a big issue. And that's why it's also important that we create a process that has rigor in the engagement, but also rigor in the impact strategy, and that they're done together so that hopefully we can influence the funders to follow the lead of community and show that it's a rigorous process that came up with it. It's not just giving them money and saying, do whatever you want, which is, I always find that so strange when funders will say, or you're saying that, no, we're going to have outcomes, we're going to measure things, we're going to have that all clear. It's just we're going to have a process to figure that out rather than one person in a room figure it out.
Right. Thanks, Paul. That makes a lot of sense. So this next question is asking, is there a time or value in having someone from outside the community serve as the convener, facilitator of initial conversation? Sometimes it seems that if one has a perspective or particular position, it might make it difficult for others to accept the quote-unquote neutral environment which is needed to support the dialogue. So talk a little bit about the role of kind of outside versus inside the community facilitators.
So, I mean, ideally it's someone inside, because that's sustainable. I think that sometimes neutrality has to be built and trust has to be built that one is neutral. And I'm a big fan of the Annie Casey Foundation's work on result-based leadership and result-based facilitation, which is a practice within that, and the workbooks that Sharebook Consulting has done on that, and the apps that they've created to help people do that. And a lot of it is looking at how do you really facilitate groups in an effective way, which always means neutral. And too often people facilitate with interest and with opinions, and they're not facilitating a purely neutral space. And neutral doesn't mean that you don't move the process forward or tell people they're off message or whatever. Neutral means that you're in open inquiry to work with the group to accomplish its stated results and agreed upon results. And if there are tensions in a community or lack of trust that needs to be built, someone outside might be able to facilitate and support that so that you can get it to a place where people inside feel that way. The other thing is that sometimes what you can do is find two people who kind of are unusual partners to facilitate together, and if they've kind of crossed some bridge, that they can help others cross that bridge. And that's another way to do it is kind of the uncommon partner method, and use that as a way to get people in.
Thanks, Paul. And I got a request. Someone was asking for just a little bit more information on results-based leadership. Can you just repeat that resource and just maybe share another sentence or two about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the Annie Casey Foundation. If you just even Google result-based leadership, and they've worked. There's the result-based accountability strategy method. There's a group called Clear Impact that does that. But the result-based leadership and facilitation, which is a practice of facilitation. There's a group called Sharebook Consulting. I think it's SHERBROOKE. But again, the Casey Foundation, if you go through their site, I think there's linkages to that work. But it's something they've helped build that I think has been immensely helpful, and I think has done a good job. Within collective impact, you want to have rigor on both sides of the equation, the collective side and the impact side. And I think so often we talk about community engagement, we sacrifice, the people who are really good at community engagement often I found are pretty weak on impact, and the folks who get really focused on data-driven impact are often very weak on engagement. And I think the ideal is to marry the two, is to have a good balance where you're firing on both, and you've got a robust strategy for the collective and a robust strategy for building the impact, and that's the ideal, is to be firing both of those.
Got it. Thanks, Paul. There's a couple questions that have come through about the size of the table. So how do you think about the right balance of broad community involvement with timely decision-making and meeting deadlines that might happen among a smaller group? So I think that, how do you think about that balance between engaging a large cross-section of the community and someone else just directly asked what's the good size for a group at the table? I know that's probably hard to say, but what's too small, what's too large? Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, since we have 299 attendees, I'll say 299. No, so I always say one of the things I've advised people, and I just want to be clear, like I'm always learning this stuff, and I learn it as I go from those I work with, and what I share today must have that caveat that this is all adaptive work and work that's often very custom to a particular community. But I think there's general principles we've been able to pull out and hopefully learn from, but they continue to grow. I think one of the things I advise people often is you can't Noah's Ark every committee. You can't have two of everything and everybody. The question is, do you have generally a mix of people that most people looking at that will feel it's a good representation, reflection of who would be needed to make those decisions? If the intended beneficiaries sat with the table in a fishbowl and watched them work, would they be like, oh, I'm glad these are the people working on this for us? that's a good way to imagine it, is imagine your beneficiaries looking at the table, and would they feel like these are the people we trust to make decisions for us. And so you don't have to have two of everything, but you do want to make sure that, again, the table's somewhat balanced and has different perspectives and people, and that most people looking at that could see people they would trust. And that's why, as I said, the uncommon partners is often something, too, is people looking and go, that's weird. I can't believe they're at the table together. That's a great thing, because that means people are thinking, wait, you know, if they're coming together, maybe others can. And so, excuse me, but I think I don't think there's a magic number. I'm definitely more of a fan for smaller versus larger, but you can also create advisory groups. You can create other means of bringing people's involvement around and perspectives to the table. You know, there's a variety of things one can do to bring those perspectives in without creating a table that gets unwieldy and difficult to manage. And again, how you facilitate that and people being clear about how decisions are made and who gets to make decisions all helps that too.
Paul, I like your point about thinking about different tables. That makes me think about it. Another recent resource that folks may be interested in is a toolkit for leading working groups, where there is a thread within that toolkit about how you apply an equity lens and how you incorporate those with lived experience in that distributed leadership approach and collective impact. So to your point, it's not necessarily having everyone at every table, but being mindful of that. Jim, were you about to jump in as well?
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think, Paul, you gave a number. I'll be so bold as to maybe give a range of something like 15 to 25. I think smaller, it's hard to be too, representative, and larger, to Paul's point, can get really unwieldy. That's totally an observation of the field, not not a prescription.
Yeah, I think that's about right. If you're too small, the problem is if you only have 75% attendance at a meeting, you get to a point where you don't even have enough to make a decision. Mm-hmm. And so, somewhere 20-ish is probably about right, in that you rarely get 100% attendance every time. But if you bat about 75% each time, you've got enough people and enough different perspectives that whoever shows up is a pretty good quorum for the community that you're trying to serve and the issue you're working on.
Yeah, and very much to Robert's point, I think, I have a steering committee or a leadership table in mind for that, and then having other work groups who are a little bit closer to the action and are where the actual work is happening is another, cascading level of engagement that's incredibly important. Another great place for bringing community members in, not only at the leadership table. So lots of places
and you might
where
create a specific, and you might create a specific advisory group too. So you might say, one of the groups I'm a board member of the United Way in Milwaukee, which has had a great collective impact for over a decade on teen pregnancy. And when the Latino rates weren't falling as quickly as the African American and white rates, they created a Latino task force. And of course, there were Latinos on the board, there were Latinos involved in leadership roles in it, but they created a task force to help really focus on strategies for that community, right? And so sometimes we can create new bodies or different bodies or task forces or advisory groups to bring other perspective in. That shouldn't be the only way that people from different demographic or neighborhood or other boundaries get involved, but it's just another way that you can kind of bring perspectives in, and without adding 20 more people to the board or whatever.
Great example.
Paul, have you seen, kind of building on this, there was a question about just specific tactics for, let's say you have a steering committee that's not very well reflective of the diversity of the community, and you do want to convince leadership to include those with lived experience and other voices. Anything you've seen that just tactically can help facilitate that conversation or work to increase, broader perspectives within the leadership?
So I think that it usually happens through a couple ways. One is that the group as a whole comes to the conclusion that it can't achieve its result unless we have other perspectives at the table who know the things we don't know. That's one. Two is that there are a couple allies who have positional power who get that and are able to convince the rest of the group to do it. And the third is that the people, the community organize and demand seats, and it happens through more of an organizing perspective. And so those are the ways I've seen it happen is either, you know, the group has consensus and clarity that it's an issue they need to deal with, or a couple people who are influential move the rest of the group to that point, or people organize and it happens through that.
Great, thanks, Paul. Another question here about kind of assessing what the community wants to have a collective impact initiative focus on. So instead of going into a community and saying this is a problem we want to address, any insights on good methods for discerning what the community truly wants to have a collective impact initiative focus on?
It's hard because what I've seen in the few places I've been is, one is people get really super tactical around their immediate needs. And so I think that there needs to be a process that gets people to a similar spot in terms of understanding the data and information and experience of what's happening in the community. I believe Promise Neighborhoods did this thing where they actually created a menu and said, here are some of the results you can work on. You can choose which ones, but here's the menu. And if you want to offer something off menu, it's got to be as rigorous as what we've got here. I've seen the open-ended process take a long time to get consensus, and often that it's hard for people to kind of, I think sometimes if they have samples to look at of what it could be, if there's a menu, if there's ways to help people move from their immediate. And the other thing I like is, you know, which the RBL groups use and others, is the data walk, where you put all the data on the wall and have people walk through it together in pairs, and they ask themselves, what's surprising, what's urgent, what's missing, and what do I want to know more about? And you have people engage with the information, not through a presentation on data, which I think is the most boring thing in the world, by pairing with someone walking and discussing it, and then in a table discussing it, and coming up with what do people think are the most important pieces of data about the community that they're seeing that are urgent and important and that they want to work on. And then everyone's working from the same set of information. And because you've asked what's missing, you're allowing people to bring their experience to bear on and their interpretations to bear. But I think that there are ways to kind of get people to the same page before you move, and that's one method I really like to use, and to really work with people to move beyond, you know, what's wrong in my community is the pothole, or this specific issue or that thing that affects, but getting people to see the broader issues and landscape. And I don't think it's hard to get people there. I think you have to be careful in how you frame it and organize it to get there.
Great. This next question, and thank you everyone for sending such great questions. I'm struggling to keep up, which is a good problem to have. So this next question, Paul, is getting at this tension between being planned and thoughtful about community engagement while also allowing space for it to emerge over time. So talk a little bit more about how you've seen authentic engagement play out with collective impact initiatives that allow the space for relationships to form over time that might be unplanned, but at the same time still being rigorous and thoughtful about how you plan for community engagement.
Well, again, the relationship building and the community building isn't in the toolkit. I mean, that's the next part, right? That being planful basically means that you're clear about why you're going to do it and how you're going to approach it. Once you're clear on that, then you can start to move toward the relationship building and the unexpected encounters and the lessons. And of course, it's going to be emergent and it's going to shift and change as you go. That's just natural. And so I think that excuse me, that the two aren't mutually exclusive. I think that just being really clear about why you want to do it, how you want to approach it, where you're going to be, how decisions will be made, and getting all of that as clear and transparent as possible, knowing what capacity you need to deliver it. And then it's about delivering it, which is a process of relationship building. And that's when you start putting more community building tools into work. There's a colleague of mine, Dan Duncan from the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, who's also at Clear Impact, who, maybe just search Dan Duncan from Clear Impact or ABCD. He's done a couple toolkits specifically on community building and collective impact that I think are pretty good. Actually, on the page, on the blog I wrote on the Collective Impact Forum, where I announced the toolkit and linked to it, I also linked in the PS to Dan's toolkit, which I thought would be a great next step once someone has a plan in terms of how do you really do truly asset-based relationship and community building. And so that's another great resource that's out there.
Great. I know this additional resources, I'm sure, is helpful for folks. And one thing, we can keep a running list. I've jotted down a couple that might be helpful to send out afterwards. The working group toolkit, that toolkit you just mentioned, Paul, your blog. We'll keep a running list if folks are having trouble tracking those down. So there's a couple questions, Paul, that have come through about kind of the resources required for community engagement. So one person asks, what about costs? How does all this get paid for? How do we institutionalize this over time? And there was another question, how do we help funders understand the time and resources that are needed to support genuine community engagement? So talk a little bit more about just the resources side of the game.
So I would say two things. The first is, yeah, there are times and ways it can be done on the cheap if the people doing it already have the relationships and trust in place where they can build on that. And so, but most of the groups that are looking to do this don't have that in place. And, the primary cost is time, right? And staff time, and the time spent building the relationships, building trust, getting to know people, getting to understand the context in the neighborhood, getting to a place where that happens. Other resources that may be involved, there's a lot of pros and cons to it, but it's, there's a lot of people who pay community residents to attend meetings with the understanding that most of the professionals at the meeting are charging it to their timesheets at their workplaces, and these people aren't able to. And that the only people who don't get paid to attend the meeting are the poor people. And, so there are groups that have done that, and there's some pros and cons to it for sure, and there's been some controversy about it, but generally, I found that it can make things fair in a way, or at least at minimum making funds available for people for any needs they have to participate. And so that's one thing that can happen. And also just, going out and doing things in the community. If you're asking people to come to your events, going to their events, sponsoring their events, helping them if there's a block party in the neighborhood, possibly sponsoring the block party, or things like that bring you and your resources into the community to be visible to people, again, as a resource they know and trust and supports their ideas and work, not just asking them to support your ideas and work.
Thanks, Paul. So another interesting question here that came through as you're thinking about engaging those with lived experience. This person says the biggest barrier to community buy-in for our project, Collective Impact Project, will likely be the willingness of clients and partner organizations to agree to share very personal financial data, but not only that staff person, but with a larger conglomerate of partners around the table. How could community engagement strategies tackle this barrier where you might be dealing with issues of confidentiality or private information?
So the reason why someone wouldn't want to share it, right, is because they don't trust that the privacy will remain private in which they share that data. And so the question is, who are the people that they trust, and have those people verified for them that the process you're using is such that it will not create the concerns that people have. So I think it's about understanding what are the privacy concerns and confidentiality concerns people have, and for people they trust to be able to kind of verify for them that that in fact those things are taken care of.
Thanks, Paul. And there were several other questions that had come through about trust that definitely speaks to those questions as well. Paul, this may be covered in some of your toolkit or in others that you've seen. Someone asked, is there any such thing as an organizational readiness assessment for authentic community engagement? So I'm thinking particularly, you referenced the spectrum as people move further to the right. Any way to assess where you are on that spectrum, or a set of questions maybe you can highlight?
Well, I think
the guide or other resources. Yeah.
I do think that I think the spectrum in its own way, if you can really honestly assess where are we today, and what's the level we have today? And most groups that I come in contact with, they haven't thought about this much, are somewhere between inform and consult, which are the two areas on the left. And then you ask yourself, where do we want? And then you might have to ask yourself, what have we communicated about where we are to community? Have we used this language? Have we possibly created some tension that we need to resolve? And then I think that we have to ask ourselves, where do we aspire to be? And what would it take to get there? And so I don't know, I think readiness is when you're ready to fulfill the commitments of that part of the spectrum. And so when I do this, so many people run to empower, and I will challenge them. Because what I do often in workshops is I'll put the 5 areas in the wall, ask people to go where they are now, and then go to where they aspire to be. And so often people run to the right, and I'm like, this is what it means to be on the right. This is what you have to be willing to give up power-wise, and then people tend to fall back a little bit. Is not go where you just I think sometimes people go to where they think it will look better for them to say they believe. But then again, what they're likely to do is produce something far less and create more tension. So again, I think you have to be clear about where are we? What's the promise involved in that, and and then we have to fulfill that promise. If we mean to be somewhere else, then we have to communicate, like, here's where we are now, here's where we're going, and these are the steps we're going to take to improve our engagement and make it more robust, and just make it as transparent and clear as possible. And I find people respect that more. And again, I think people respect if you say, like, listen, the reality is that our mayor and our board and this group have designed this process, and we're about to go in decision making, and we want to get your input and feedback before we make a final decision. If people are clear that's what it is, then they know what they're coming to. And those who come, they might bitch about the process coming up to that, but they'll engage. But if you say we're going to empower you to be involved as collaborators in the process, and here is all the work, can you give us our feedback before we make a decision, then you're going to have a lot of conflict and a lot of people pissed off. So I think it's just clear, like, readiness, where are you? Are you comfortable being there? And then there's some things you can do, like look at what's the story of the community that your materials tell. So often, we see these materials where the cover are these photos of multicultural children, and then you go to the back of the book and you see the committee and it's all old white people. Or we look at, we tell stories about our community that are all about how sad and hopeless and troubled it is. And we have to sometimes look and ask, and there's part of the asset-based tool in this, is that we can ask ourselves, what's the story that we're telling about the community we're in? And how might people in the community perceive the story we're telling about the community we're in? And I think that's another piece of really looking at our readiness, is understanding what might we be doing that might send messages to community that we're not trustworthy, that we don't really want their engagement, that we're telling a story they don't feel about, that isn't the community that they look at, the one that's in our annual report. And so I think that those kinds of things can be helpful to really do that kind of analysis.
And Paul, this I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, so maybe one or two more questions before I pass it back over to Jen. Building on that comment you just made about being intentional and clear about your intended level of engagement, have you been in situations where there's let's say among a steering committee, there's a wide range of perspectives about what the intent is, and let's say that there's some folks who are struggling to get behind the idea of moving further to the right in terms of being more close to the idea of empowering those in the community. How do you go about building kind of support among leaders and decision makers to adopt a more authentic community engagement strategy? What are some ways that you've found to bring folks along, maybe if there is a disagreement in what the purpose should be?
Again, I think that we have to ask ourselves and find examples that demonstrate to date how our lack of engagement have led us to make assumptions or interpret information in ways that has not helped us come up with better strategies and solutions. I always say that one of the reasons why we want to do collective impact is we've come to the conclusion that more and better of the status quo will not produce a different result. And so the status quo has been institutions with their professional staff and influential boards making decisions about how to solve problems in communities. And what that system has produced is the graduation rate and the teen pregnancy rate and the infant mortality rate and all those other rates that we have right now. That's what that system has produced. And if we're trying to come up, if we have a sense of urgency that we can get to a better and different result, then we have to be willing to do it in a different way. And we have to say that probably one thing we might want to look at is maybe if we had different perspectives and experience at our table, we could get to different strategies and solutions and open ourselves up to that. And so I think that if we remain if we focus on how it limits our ability to achieve our results, and we can gain commitment that, yeah, we can't turn the curve on infant mortality without community residents at the table. We can't turn the curve on teen pregnancy if we don't really understand how information is received in different parts of our community and how young people are responding to that and their lifestyles and culture changing so quickly, then we need to bring those perspectives in. And so I think that, again, if we make that case, we can get closer to that. And so I find that's better than making a case that it's again, making the case from a representational view only without really recognizing that that representation actually influences our ability to achieve the result. And if we stay result-focused in that way, I think we can move more people to understanding why it's important. And as I said, anytime we can hold up examples of where we interpreted or assumed information that turned out wrong that would have been corrected if we had more perspectives in the room, would help us.
Thanks, Paul. I wish we had more time. This hour flew by. I'm going to pass it back over to Jen to wrap up our hour. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and Paul, I will echo Robert's thanks for being so generous with your time and wisdom with us today, and we're eternally grateful. So thanks to all of you who also sent questions. We will be sending out a link to the recording in the next few days so you can share it with others if you're interested. We're seeing Paul on his screen with his virtual coffee. That's amazing. Way to go. And just so everyone knows, we are also announcing the date for our next virtual coffee on June 6th. The topic will be using data in collective impact. And we look forward to next month's coffee chat and hope you can join us. Thank you, everybody.